In Revelation chapter 13, we have a beast that rises up out of the sea being a tumultuous sea of nations, the raging of nations, the war-making powers of the world. Actually, this beast that rises up, in my opinion, is the rise of world government. The United Nations has been looking toward and preparing for such a government for many years. But to date, the UN has been impotent. It has been unable to bring sovereignty to itself. One of these days, in the middle of the tribulation period, a world government will get the sovereignty from all the nations of the world, and at that time will be able to set up spontaneously, almost overnight, a government that will rule for 42 months. It's a short rule, but it's because everything is set in place and all it needs is sovereignty. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the beast out of the sea.
And J.R., this comprises one of the major Bible themes that we find all the way through the Bible, going back to Genesis 11, when the kings gathered themselves and built a tower to reach to heaven. And there are various ways in which world governments have striven to conquer everything in sight. We think of Babylon and Medo-Persia, Greece and Rome, and these efforts, one after another. And J.R., in his article on Revelation 13, has quoted Psalm 2 and 3. The kings of the earth set themselves, the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. That describes what's going on here in Revelation 13.
It is my opinion that the United Nations is the catalyst upon which this world government will rise. Just because it's something that has developed in this last century, over this past generation, is not the only reason why I think this. It is the only worldwide effort to establish world government that there has ever been in the history of the human race. Now, I realize there have been tyrants who have tried to establish world government through conquest, but this is the first time the nations, the kings, have taken counsel together against the Lord and tried to set up such a thing. Well, in verses 3 and 4, we are told that this creature has a deadly wound in the head. I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wandered after the beast. You know, it is generally believed that the Antichrist will be assassinated, receive a head wound by a sword, and I guess 3 days later will rise again. And of course, this has been bolstered by Zechariah's prophecy concerning the foolish shepherd, wherein he says, the sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened. But Dr. C.I. Scofield has written concerning this deadly wound in the head of this beast, and he says, quote, fragments of the ancient Roman Empire have never ceased to exist as separate kingdoms. It was the imperial form of government which ceased, the one head wounded to death. So there is at least a diversity of opinions as to whether this deadly wound in the head is inflicted upon a single person, the Antichrist, or upon some imperial form of government.
And J.R., it's worth noting that in our day, in fact, as we make this broadcast, the United States government is preparing to make war, and the United Nations is set against that idea. And the result of this is that many have said the United Nations is in danger of becoming irrelevant. That is, if it can't gather itself together to make a declaration of war upon a tyrant, then it has no power at all. And J.R., this perfectly ties in with what you're saying. There are a lot of people saying the UN is simply impotent, irrelevant, and in danger of falling completely apart.
The important thing is the United Nations has a bureaucracy, all of the committees, everything ready for sovereignty. It just doesn't have the sovereignty. No nation has been willing to cede their sovereignty to the UN as yet. And I think during the first half of the tribulation period, the United Nations will be a failure, an absolute failure. But in the middle of the tribulation period, when the devil comes down to earth and is ready to elevate the Antichrist to commit the abomination of desolation and to establish the mark of the beast, this beast out of the sea, this world government, will suddenly be given power. You know, Gary, it says that it rules for 42 months, which means there is no time to set up committees, to have discussions, to make plans. Everything has to be ready, and overnight, sovereignty is given to it, and it begins to rule.
One of the elements of this sovereignty seems to be the head. Revelation 13:3 says, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed." Now, the question immediately arises, who is this one head? Or how should we interpret the one head? The head could be one of the great leaders of the world, perhaps a leading financial power. What do you think about that, J.R.?
Well, you know, in Revelation chapter 17, the woman rides the beast. And we are told that the 7 heads upon this beast are 7 mountains upon which the woman sits. These 7 mountains also represent kingdoms, because it says, "And there are 7 kings." Verses 10 and 11 of chapter 17 says, "5 are fallen, and one is. The other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. The beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition." Now, Gary, Dr. E.W. Bullinger, in his commentary on Revelation, describes these as Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, the Mohammedan Empire, or the Ottoman Empire of Turkey, who ruled, by the way, the Middle East for 500 years. Beyond that, and Bullinger is writing just after the turn of the century of the 1900s, beyond that, Bullinger cannot see into the future, but he suggests that the 6th kingdom will give the Jews opportunity to return to their promised land. The fascinating thing about this is, even though he didn't live to see it, Great Britain and the Balfour Declaration became evidently that 6th kingdom. But then he goes on to say the 7th kingdom would be the kingdom of the beast. And Gary, the British turned the Middle East, especially Israel, Palestine, over to the United Nations. Bingo. We've got the 7th beast.
And so it was that the great British Empire, upon which the sun never set, was diminished and became almost a minor power, J.R., after it dealt the horrific blow to Israel that it did. To the British was given the great mandate to return the people to the land, and they could have done that, but they balked at it. They pulled back their support, and they were a curse to the people of Israel, and that has set up the chain of events that we see today.
And liberating Jerusalem in 1917 was the first step, with the Balfour Declaration, to establish a homeland for the Jewish people, and it was the United Nations who voted to establish the State of Israel in 1947. They became a state in May of 1948. Listen to what I've written concerning Bullinger. Placing the rise of the beast as the 7th head, Bullinger leaves room for the British and their noble effort to restore the Jew to his land. Bullinger writes, quote, "The 6th kingdom will have obtained sovereignty or independence for the Jews." And that is precisely what the British have done through the British Mandate. I think Bullinger is to be commended, Gary.
Yes.
Just seemed, his assessment of the 6th and 7th kingdoms seems to be right on target. And the fascinating thing about all of this is that the United Nations is now the 7th kingdom that is receiving the deadly wound, but will be revived in the middle of the tribulation period with sovereignty to rule over the entire world.
Now, we're not sitting in a spot that allows us to name names. This is all yet to unfold in the future. We cannot be perfectly discerning when it comes to the nations that will be in charge, who will be directing whom. What we have here are a number of symbols, and as we look at these symbols, there's a great deal of difficulty in putting them together in a particular way. However, that's not going to stop us. We're going to make an effort.
Sure, why not? We don't know the future any more than anyone else, but it is fascinating that Bullinger was able to sort of put all this thing together. And these 7 heads looks like to me that this monstrosity coming out of the sea of nations over the centuries is all combined together, you know. The lion and the leopard and the feet of a bear and so on. But let's talk about the mouth, speaking great things. There's a lot to say about that mouth, because the mouth is the spokesman for the UN. He is the Antichrist, and we'll tell you more about it when we return in just a moment. In Revelation 13:5 and 6, we are told, "And that was given unto him a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven." We have arrived now at the focus of this situation. As, shall we say, John focuses his prophetic telescope in, zooms in on the mouth, we are about to see the spokesman for this new world order, this United Nations. Who knows? It may be some future General Secretary or Secretary General of the United Nations
J.R.,
that becomes the mouth. Speaking
it could very well be. A mouth speaking great things. Wow. You know, Daniel chapter 7, describing the fourth beast that would rule the world. And remember this, when Daniel's talking about the fourth beast, this is the beast that would be judged by God. And that beast had horns, and Daniel says, "Behold, there came up among them another little horn." And of course, this horn had a mouth speaking great things, which takes us right to Revelation.
It's the same scene we have there.
Yes.
Now, the Antichrist does not just appear in the middle of the tribulation period. He's been around for a while. He probably heads up the UN in its weakened, impotent form for the first 3.5 years. It may be that he is the one who actually enforces the peace between Israel and the Palestinians, who confirms by military strength the covenant with many. Perhaps enforcing a peace treaty. I know that our government has been in favor of the peace treaty, but the Palestinians are not. It seems like they're going to have someone beside the great Satan, the United States, to be in favor of this. If the whole world were to get together at the United Nations General Assembly or the UN Security Council and say to Israel and to the Palestinians, this is the way it's going to be, and they put UN troops there on the Temple Mount throughout Jerusalem and throughout Israel to stand between the warring factions, then this could be just the thing we're looking for. But in the middle of the tribulation period, something spectacular takes place. The Antichrist commits the abomination of desolation.
Well, J.R., when you just finished verse 6, I was thinking about that. It says, "He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven." That's an indictment. If there's ever an indictment, not only to blaspheme the name of God, but also the tabernacle of God and those that dwell in heaven, the saints of God. This man knows no bounds in his blasphemy. And so that term, abomination of desolation, that we've heard about so much in the past, really takes on a new meaning in this context.
And so we have everything set up now for the abomination of desolation, which occurs in the middle of the tribulation period. When he speaks out against God, against the tabernacle, that must be the one set up in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Mm-hmm. He goes then to the tabernacle. According to the Apostle Paul, he will sit in the tabernacle claiming to be God. This is the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, the Apostle Paul says, "Let no man deceive you by any means. For that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that it is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Gary, this is the big moment. The middle of the tribulation period, The devil comes down and calls forth this beast, heals his deadly wound, makes the United Nations a sovereign entity on planet Earth, and everyone is forced to submit. The world's not going to just roll over and play dead. These various countries, such as the Muslim countries, you can't talk them into submitting to the UN. It's got to be by force, be some kind of conquering entity.
And yet Revelation 13:9 says, "And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." In other words, J.R., there will be universal acclamation for this new power. It will be seen as the solution to the world's problems. There will be dancing in the streets.
Yes. Now, as the 42 months gets closer to its conclusion, as the 7 years winds down to the Battle of Armageddon, Daniel tells us that the Antichrist will hear rumblings out of the north and evil tidings out of the east. And so not everyone in the world is going to be accepting this UN entity, this one world government. But it'll take time for them to muster their opinion and get their armies together. Logistically, it's going to take some time to foment the Battle of Armageddon.
And probably we are seeing the opening phase of the logistics right now, today, if we just know what to look for and which newspaper articles to read. Things are happening. Interesting things are happening. We have but a few moments left to discuss the beast out of the earth, which follows this passage we've been reading. Revelation 13:11, "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and spake as a dragon." And this beast is an amazing beast in many ways.
Yes, he is called the false prophet. Now, Gary, I see John taking his prophetic telescope and seeing a beast rise up out of the sea of nations. He zooms in and sees the mouth, who is the Antichrist. He zooms in a little closer and sees the beast rise up out of the sea. I think this is another picture of the Antichrist. Now, I know he's called a false prophet, but the big problem that I have with him being a separate entity from the Antichrist is that he has all the power of the beast before him. He has the ability to commit the abomination of desolation. Nowhere else in the Old Testament or the New is the false prophet a separate entity. I don't see any other prophecies about him.
Furthermore, this is the beast who issues a system whereby everyone must receive a certain mark in order to buy or sell, meaning you starve if you don't have the mark. And also, the Bible says that there's a particular code number, a method of understanding his identity by the number of his name. So all of these things taken together suggest that this is a magnified view of one part of that beast out of the sea.
Now, it was the first of the writing prophets, Moses, who one day said, "The Lord will raise up a prophet from among the people like unto me, unto him you shall hearken." And the writers of the Bible have said that is Jesus. Jesus is that prophet. Well, if Jesus is that prophesied prophet, then the false prophet has to be a false Jesus, a false Messiah, or basically the Antichrist. He looks like a lamb. That's what Jesus is called 28 times in the book of Revelation, the Lamb of God. And he talks like or spake like a dragon. That means that he is the devil incarnate.
And by the way, we know how the dragon speaks because we remember how he talked to Eve. Very persuasive, very unctuous, shall we say politically savvy. I can see a political figure becoming this kind of man. Can't you, J.R.?
Yes. And when it's all over, of course, the beast and the false prophet are going to be cast into the lake of fire, which causes a lot of people to say the beast is the Antichrist and the false prophet is his sidekick. But I just don't see that in Daniel. I don't see that in the prophecies that Jesus gave in Matthew 24. I don't see that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It is my opinion, therefore, that this beast out of the earth is the Antichrist himself, and all of this means his form of government, the bureaucracy to establish world government, and the Antichrist himself, who makes it all work. And he commits the abomination of desolation and makes everyone in the world get a mark or a number or a name in order to buy or sell. Well, it's a fascinating study. We'll have to continue on our next program. We'll be back in just a moment.